Dennis had been working the night shift as a mall security guard for over 5 years. He was used to long hours of boredom, endless cups of coffee, the hum of the CCTV monitors, and the occasional raccoon setting off the motion sensors. The shopping mall was old, nearly abandoned except for a few stores that still clung to life. At night, it was a different world, dark hallways, shuttered storefronts, and a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on him. It was close to 2 a.m. when something unusual caught his eye. One of the security monitors flickered. At first, he brushed it off as interference. Old wiring, faulty camera, it wasn't uncommon. But when he leaned in, Dennis froze. For a split second, he swore he saw someone sitting in the middle of the food court, at one of the plastic tables. The figure wasn't moving, just sitting there, head bowed, like a late-night diner. He blinked, leaned closer. The next second, the seat was empty. Dennis rubbed his eyes, muttering to himself. He'd been awake too long, maybe the caffeine was messing with his head. But then, the same camera glitched again. This time, his stomach dropped. A dark shape, almost like a person, was standing behind the counter of a burger joint that had been shut down for years. Heart hammering, Dennis picked up his flashlight. His job was to check it out, even if his instincts screamed at him not to. The food court was on the far side of the mall, a 5-minute walk through echoing, empty corridors. Every step he took, the sound bounced back at him unnaturally loud, as if someone else was following him at a distance. When he finally reached the food court, the air felt colder. His flashlight beam cut across dusty tables, chairs stacked against walls, and empty vending machines. Nothing. He approached the old burger counter, shining his light behind it. The greasy grill sat untouched, the broken soda fountain covered in cobwebs. It was just as abandoned as always. Then he heard it, a voice, low, right next to his ear. Hungry. Dennis jumped back so hard he almost dropped his flashlight. He spun around, shining the light in every direction, his breath ragged. There was no one there. His chest tightened, a wave of panic threatening to overwhelm him. He forced himself to breathe, muttering, "It's in your head. Just your head." But he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. The shadows seemed thicker, clinging to the corners of the room. He hurried back toward the security office, every nerve on fire. The walk back felt longer, like the corridors had stretched. By the time he reached the office, sweat clung to his shirt. He shut the door, locked it, and dropped heavily into his chair, trying to convince himself it was just exhaustion. But then, as his eyes drifted back to the monitors, the blood drained from his face. On the very screen that had glitched earlier, the shadowy figure was back. Not in the food court this time. Not behind the burger counter. It was in his office. On the monitor, the dark figure was sitting in his chair, leaning back as though it had been there the entire night, its face obscured in static blur. It was watching the other cameras with eerie stillness, as if guarding them all alongside him. Dennis felt the air in the room shift. The temperature plummeted, his breath forming in pale clouds. His hands shook so violently the flashlight clattered to the floor. And then, slowly, as if it sensed him watching, it turned its head on the monitor. Directly toward the camera that was filming the office. Toward him. Dennis stumbled back, hitting the wall. But when he looked around the office, the chair was empty, except for himself. He glanced back at the monitor, heart threatening to burst. The shadow was gone. The chair on screen sat empty once more. Yet Dennis couldn't shake the final, horrifying detail. On the desk beside the monitor, a cold, greasy burger wrapper that hadn't been there before. Maya had always thought of herself as practical. Working security at a construction site wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. She liked the solitude, the quiet nights, the occasional sound of an owl somewhere in the distance. Her shift started at 8 p.m. and ended at dawn, a long stretch of hours to fill with perimeter checks, log entries, and endless walks around steel skeletons of half-finished buildings. The site she guarded was a massive apartment complex under construction. By day, it was alive with the buzz of saws, hammers, and shouts of workers. But by night, it was desolate, like the bones of a dead giant, tall frames of concrete and steel standing against the sky, their hollow floors echoing with every breeze. One particular night, near midnight, she was making her routine round when her radio crackled faintly with static. She frowned. There wasn't anyone else on shift, she was alone. Before she could think much of it, a metallic clang rang out, sharp and heavy, from somewhere high up the main building. The sound wasn't faint. It was the kind of crash made when something heavy struck steel. Her first thought was that a group of kids had slipped in. It happened occasionally, though the fences were high and locked. She sighed, picked up her flashlight, and began climbing the unfinished stairwell. Dust rose with each of her steps, and the bare concrete walls seemed to squeeze tighter the further she went up. On the fourth floor, she paused. Her boots crunched on gravel and plaster. But then she realized, she wasn't the only one making noise. There were footsteps above her. Slow, heavy, out of sync with her own. She froze, her ears straining. When she stopped, the sound continued for 2 more steps before fading. Her mouth went dry, but she shook it off, muttering, probably wind, or rats. Still, the unease gnawed at her stomach. She climbed higher, her flashlight sweeping across empty floors filled with scaffolding, scattered tools, and plastic sheeting flapping in the draft. By the time she reached the 10th floor, the night air bit colder. She stepped out into a wide open space, the skeleton of what would become luxury apartments. The city skyline flickered in the distance, but here, the floor was empty. Dead quiet, no kids, no intruders. Her flashlight beam caught a pile of stacked cinder blocks near the elevator shaft. They had been neatly arranged earlier in the day by the workers. She made a note in her head to log the noise as possible structural settling. She turned to head back down the stairs. That's when she heard it. A scraping sound. Low, steady. She spun around just as one of the cinder blocks slid across the floor. Not tipped, not kicked, it dragged, slow and deliberate, leaving a pale chalky trail of dust behind it. It stopped inches from her boots. Her chest tightened. She staggered back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The air around her grew heavy, thick with something she couldn't explain. Then, from the elevator shaft behind the blocks, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow shifting where no light should have been. Then, it crawled into view. A figure, tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, bent at sharp angles as it pulled itself out of the shaft like an insect emerging from a hole. Its head tilted sideways, neck too thin to support it, and its body moved with a sickening fluidity, jerky but smooth, as though joints bent the wrong way. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Her instinct screamed at her to run. But her legs wouldn't move. The figure crawled forward, fingers scraping against the floor, long arms stretching toward her. That was all it took. She turned and bolted. Her boots pounded against concrete as she sprinted into the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. Behind her, the sound of scraping followed, fast, uneven, like something chasing but never quite catching her. By the time she burst out onto the ground floor, her lungs burned, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might explode. She didn't stop running until she was back in the security shack, slamming the door shut and locking it. For nearly an hour, she sat with her flashlight trained on the door, hands shaking, listening for movement. But the night outside was silent again, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, she tried to explain what she'd seen to the site manager. He stared at her for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then he shrugged and said quietly, almost too casually, "Oh, that's not the first time someone's seen it." Maya never worked another night at that site again. Luis never minded working nights. In fact, he preferred them. The hospital parking garage wasn't exactly exciting, but it was steady work and quiet compared to the chaos inside the hospital itself. He'd sit in the small booth with his monitors, sipping cheap coffee, making the occasional patrol through the levels of parked cars. Still, there was one place he hated, the basement level. The lowest floor of the garage was cold, damp, and always half-lit, as though the fluorescent bulbs down there were deliberately dimmer. It was rarely used, only for overflow parking, but Luis always felt an uneasy weight when he walked those rows of cars, as if the shadows stretched too long and followed him. One night, around 3 a.m., the motion sensor alarm for the basement level went off. The monitor in his booth blinked, showing the grainy black and white feet of the floor. Nothing moved, but the system didn't trigger for no reason. Protocol demanded a manual check. With a sigh, Luis strapped on his flashlight, grabbed his keys, and rode the elevator down. As the doors slid open, the air that met him was 10 degrees colder than upstairs. His breath puffed out in small clouds, unusual in a concrete garage sealed from the weather. He stepped out cautiously, sweeping his flashlight across the rows. At first, everything looked normal, rows of silent cars, their windows glinting faintly in the dim overhead lights. But then, soft and faint, he heard it. A woman crying. It was distant, echoing between the pillars. A soft, broken sobbing that rose and fell. Luis froze. His training kicked in. Could be a patient who wandered off, or someone in distress. He called out, his voice bouncing off the concrete. "Hello, Mom. Are you all right?" The crying stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so sharp, so sudden, it felt unnatural. Luis swallowed hard. He swept his flashlight across the garage, his beam dancing over empty spaces, the silver tops of cars, the far corners that seemed impossibly dark. Then, without warning, a car alarm blared. The sudden shriek nearly made him drop his light. The sound echoed painfully in the enclosed space. He rushed toward it, boots slapping against the cold floor. It was a sedan near the center row, its hazard lights flashing, horn blaring. The back door was open. Luis slowed as he approached, every instinct screaming to stop, to leave, but duty pulled him forward. He aimed his flashlight into the back seat, and froze. A pale face stared back at him. A woman, sitting stiffly in the shadows, her skin ghost white, her eyes impossibly wide, her mouth open in a silent scream. Her hair hung in damp strands across her face, and her gaze, though frozen, seemed locked directly on his. Luis stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. His flashlight beam shook violently, spilling across the car's interior. But when he blinked, just once, the back seat was empty. The door hung open, but there was no one there. The alarm cut off abruptly. Silence swallowed the space again. His chest heaved. His palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. He turned, ready to run back to the elevator. But something made him glance back at the car one last time. On the fogged rear window, letters had been traced by a finger. "Help me." Luis bolted. He didn't look back, didn't breathe until he was safely inside the booth again with the door locked tight. His heart pounded against his ribs like a drum, but the worst came when he looked at the security footage. On the monitor, the grainy camera feed showed him walking through the basement as expected. But he wasn't alone. For nearly the entire patrol, a woman followed him. She was visible in the background, sometimes standing between the cars, sometimes walking directly behind him, just a few paces away. In some frames, she was weeping into her hands, in others, her mouth stretched wide in a scream he couldn't hear. And every time the static flickered, she was closer, almost brushing his shoulder. Luis watched the footage, frozen, his throat dry. The final image before the tape cut to black showed him sprinting toward the elevator, while the pale woman leaned from behind a pillar, her face pressed close to the lens, eyes staring directly into the camera. Luis resigned the next morning. He never set foot in that garage again.